Hi there. In this topic video, we're going to focus on monopoly in markets. Monopoly is the most highly concentrated of the market structures, and in this introductory video, we'll look at some examples of monopoly power in different industries. So there's various types of monopoly, various definitions we can focus on. Pure monopoly is an example of a market structure with only one firm, and the firm is protected from competition by significant barriers to entry. The London Underground takes us close to a pure monopoly. Effectively, it's a natural monopoly, but of course there is some competition from other forms of transport. A working monopoly is a firm with at least 25% of the market, so it does have some monopoly power, and it's actually the legal definition of a monopoly used in the UK. But typically a working monopoly operates within an oligopoly. There may be some other bigger firms as well as a cluster of smaller firms competing for market share. Sometimes we have a competitive oligopoly in markets. So for example, Costa Coffee and Starbucks are the two leading chains of coffee stores. Occasionally we have, for example, a duopoly, which is where two firms dominate the industry. And a good example of that is Pepsi and Coca-Cola. So in terms of definitions, a pure monopoly is a single seller that dominates the entire market of which it's a member, and the market has effectively 100% concentration. Well, how do we get close to this? Google, in terms of web search in the UK, has had a pretty much near monopoly for many years, although notice that its share of the search engine market in the UK has started to diminish a little bit in the early months of 2016. But its market share is well over 85%. And has been for a long time. In reality, the Competition and Markets Authority, that's the body that's the main competition authority in Britain, they define a working monopoly as any firm with greater than 25% of an industry's total sales. Here's an example of a working monopoly in the mobile handset business in the UK. Samsung is the leading brand in mobile handsets with just over 31% of the market. Apple is second, Nokia third. If we add together the 5-firm concentration ratio for this market, we find it's over 84%. So it's clearly an oligopoly, but one firm has more than 30% of the market, nearly a third of the market. Here's another good example of an industry where there's lots of monopoly power. This is the change in global market share held by the major personal computer vendors from 2006 to 2015. Hewlett-Packard is a significant player, although its market share has been relatively stable in recent times. Notice the rapid growth to prominence of the Chinese business Lenovo. Dell's market share has remained above 10%. Acer's market share has declined. Apple's share has risen, according to this measure. But effectively, the top firms have increased their dominance of the market. Whereas in 2006, nearly half the market was in the hands of other firms, in 2015, only 27% was in the hands of the other firms. So the market has become more concentrated. A dominant firm is defined as a firm that has at least 40% of their given market. Let's go through that again. A working monopoly has at least 25% of their market. A dominant firm has at least 40% of the industry. Here's an example of a dominant firm. Coca-Cola in the United States has a 42% plus market share. Notice how stable that position is over the last 10 years. If we take, for example, AB In-Bev, one of the world's biggest brewing companies, they have a market share of more than 40% in quite a number of countries. More than 78% in Argentina, nearly 70% in Brazil, more than half the market in South Korea, Mexico and Belgium. And the United States and Canada, their market share is significantly above 40%. Less so, of course, in the UK, less than 20%. So here's a good example of AB InBev, a business that has real, genuine, dominant market power in a number of important markets. Let's look at the market for internet browsers. This chart shows the global market share by internet browser from 2012 through to the spring of 2015. And we can see the rise of Chrome as an operating browser, the decline of Internet Explorer, and the growth of Safari. But effectively, this is a good example of Chrome now having a market share of more than 40%. Oftentimes, businesses, of course, can grow very quickly and achieve market power quite rapidly. This chart shows the annual growth, the year-on-year growth of the revenues of Amazon and eBay. And in nearly every year, the revenue growth is double-digit. Rapid growth can often lead to monopoly power quite quickly. So, we define a working monopoly as any firm with more than 25% of market share, a dominant firm with at least 40% of their market. But in reality, it's quite important to note that any firm which has some market power and can set its own prices is operating in an imperfectly competitive market and will face a downward sloping demand curve. You don't have to be a monopoly to be able to choose and set your own prices. This is a good example of scale and market power. So in the express and courier service market globally, the giant US firm UPS has nearly 20%, and FedEx isn't that far behind. Deutsche Post, DHL, is the biggest European firm. The 5-firm concentration ratio is 51%, not quite enough for an oligopoly. But keep in mind that these are scaled businesses. These are huge organisations with big revenues and big profits. They've got market power, even if they don't necessarily satisfy the precise definition of the term. Chinese firms are starting to increase in prominence in lots of different industries, from telecommunications to the web, Alibaba, etc., to computers. And here's a little known market, the wind turbine industry. It shows the global market share of the world's biggest wind turbine manufacturers in 2014. 5-firm concentration ratio is lower than 50%. There are quite a few players in the market, but you would expect that concentration ratio to increase over time as dominant players emerge and through a process of merger and acquisition. But note that already 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of the leading firms are Chinese. China is developing a comparative and a competitive advantage in the wind turbine manufacturing sector. Let's look at the European market for cars, passenger cars rather than light vehicles and vans, what have you. Volkswagen, much in the news recently to do with the carbon emissions scandal. Volkswagen satisfies the criteria for being called a working monopoly. In 2014, they had just over 25% of the European car market based on new registrations, new vehicles. And other firms were tucking in behind. The top 5 firms have more than 60%. But here's a good example of a working monopoly inside an oligopoly. The definition of monopoly is contingent on the scale and the scope of the market we're looking at. And this is a really important evaluation point, particularly in a data response question. So what monopoly power is depends in part on how we actually define the scope and the size of the market. Are we looking at the market from a global point of view, motor vehicles, wind turbines? Are we looking at it from a national point of view, coffee shops, a regional point of view, regional water monopolies, for example, or even a local monopoly? There might only be one pub or one bank or one post office or one petrol station in a local area. That's really quite important. Postal services, for example, that's a big industry. We might break it down and look, for example, at letters and parcels. There's probably more competition in parcels than there is in letters. If we look at the beer industry, the pub industry, are we looking at the rural area? Well, often there are local monopolies. Or are we looking at urban areas, towns and cities, where there's often a lot of choice, even on the same street? Monopoly power depends on how you define the market. And that's the key takeaway point from this slide. So in this introductory video, we've introduced the idea of monopoly power and looked at lots of examples of market share to see firms that are monopolists. But of course, there are different definitions of what a monopoly is. We'll leave the cost and the revenue analysis diagrams for a separate video, so be sure to check out the YouTube channel for that one. Thanks a lot for joining in on this revision video.